Okay. So, good evening, everyone. As we continue going through some of the midot, the personality characteristics, it's very appropriate, I believe, to talk about some of the characteristics, the personality, the feelings that are most connected to Tisha B'Av, which we are commemorating on this coming Saturday night and Sunday morning. Well, Sunday day, but we have services Saturday night and Sunday morning. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for some or all of that. And we're going to be using a word today that I think a lot of people don't know. Even if you speak English as your first language, a lot of people kind of sort of know the word, but they don't really know what it is. Hatred, I think most people know what it means to feel hatred. Sadly, that's a very common word. Rebuke is the word that we're going to talk about a lot, what it means, because it's a really important Hebrew idea. In Hebrew, it is tochacha. And tochacha is sometimes easier to say than rebuke because most people don't know what rebuke means. Rebuke is sometimes connected to criticism, right? To point out when somebody has done something that you think is wrong, right? Your boss, when you come in late and your boss says, "Why are you half an hour late today?" Right? "Don't you know I need you here at 9 o'clock, right on the dot. You can't come in late." That is rebuke. But in Judaism, we believe there is good rebuke and bad rebuke. And as we're going to see, the rabbis believe that it was bad rebuke and hatred that destroyed the temple. Not the Romans. I mean, the Romans were the ones with the catapults and the weapons, but the thing that really destroyed our Second Temple period was hatred and rebuke. So these are very, very important ideas. Okay? All right, so we're gonna build and see how this goes. So for the destruction, right, the rabbis ask, as we are commemorating Tisha B'Av, upon which both the first temple and second temple were destroyed, why? Right? Why was the first temple destroyed? And they're not asking the history. They don't, they're not asking about the Babylonians. They want to know, why was it decided by God that the first temple would be able to fall? And they said, well, because of three evils in it, right? Idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed, right? So idolatry, worshiping idols, immorality, which means like adultery or incest, if you're taking your neighbor's wife and that kind of thing, that's what they mean by immorality. And bloodshed, murder, right? Those were the three main crimes that existed during the time of the first temple. But why was the second temple destroyed? Seeing that during the time it stood, people occupied themselves with Torah, the observance of mitzvot, the practice of tzedakah. So they're saying, look, during the second temple, okay, maybe some of the kings like Herod weren't so good, but the common people, they weren't murdering people. They weren't worshiping idols. They weren't, sleeping with their neighbor's wife. The people were generally doing commandments. They were generally observant people. So why was it destroyed? Because during the time it stood, baseless hatred, what we call sinat chinam, which means hatred given freely, right? You remember in the 60s, people talked about free love. This is free hate, right? I'll hate anybody. I don't need a reason, right? Baseless hatred prevailed. This is to teach you that sinat chinam, this hatred, is deemed as grave. It is as serious as all the three sins of idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed together. Right? So if you have a scale and you put murder and adultery and idolatry over here, and you put hating other people with no good reason over here, the hatred is worse. Because it took all three of these to destroy the first temple, but it only took baseless hatred to destroy temple number 2, even though the people were doing the mitzvot, even though people were doing commandments. Because they may have been doing the commandments. They may have been wearing the talit, wearing tefillin, keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat. They may have even been honest in their business. And maybe they weren't even doing lashon hara. Maybe they weren't gossiping and doing those things. But in their heart, they hated each other. Now, we know historically that this was the time when you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, and you had the Zealots, and you had the people who were trying to be Roman, and the people who didn't want any religion. You had all these different groups, and they were all arguing with each other. And even if they weren't always fighting, like murder, in their heart, they went, I hate those people. I hate them. I hate them. And that hatred is what tore our country apart. And that's why the Second Temple was destroyed. Make sense? Okay. Come on. But we have Rebuke. Oh, that should be tochacha, not techacha. That should be an O there. Sorry for the typo. Tochacha. We know from the book of Leviticus, you shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kinsmen. Reprove is another word for rebuke, right? Reprove. See, I can't even say it in English. Reprove your kinsmen, but incur no guilt because of them. This is in Leviticus 19, and it's a very complicated verse, right? Don't hate somebody in your heart, but you should criticize. You should point out to them. You should teach them if they are making a mistake. But while you're doing that, don't make a new sin. What? I mean, if I'm a teacher and the kid writes 2 + 2 = 5, and I put a big red mark next to that, right? I'm just pointing out the mistake. How could I be sinning, right? I'm just pointing out a mistake. And that's what Leviticus and what our sages are trying to show us, is that sometimes, yes, when you're trying to teach another person, you are going to cause a new sin. And sometimes if you don't teach a person, you're going to cause a new sin. Right? You're kind of trapped. Because if you keep your mouth shut, sometimes it's the wrong answer. And if you open your mouth, sometimes it's the wrong answer. Which means you have to know when to talk and when not to talk. When to rebuke and when not to rebuke. And that's what we're going to talk about here. We're going to give some examples from the rabbinic literature and some of the halakha. Okay. So let's talk about when you have to, right? When do you talk? When do you do something? Well, sometimes you have to, as we say in English, you have to step up, right? You see a problem and you have to step up. And the Darchei Moshe, one of the great medieval commentators, says there are 4 actions of Moses, our leader, right? Moshe Rabbeinu, that inform us of the greatness of spirit, right? That show us how great he was. He was with divine courage. He was distinguished, and who could not bear to see persecution and oppression, right? If he saw something bad happening to another person, he had to try and stop it. That was what his heart was like. Now notice, they're not talking about if he saw something that was being done bad to himself. They're not saying if he saw something that was done bad but didn't affect another person. They're saying if he saw something wrong that affected another person, right? You see a bully, the classic example. Then he stepped up, right? He did all he could to save and redeem others. When he was in the royal palace, Moses went out to see with his own eyes the situation of our brothers, the house of Israel. Remember, he grew up with Pharaoh's daughter as his mother. He could have stayed in the Egyptian royalty and just lived like the Egyptian prince and had a nice life, very comfortable, very easy. But he chose to go out and see what the slaves were experiencing. And when he went out, right, and his beating of the Egyptian, who beat one of the fellow Hebrews, and his rebuke to this evil Hebrew who beat his fellow man, and his saving of the daughters of Midianite the priest and Yitro from the hand of shepherds and robbers. So the going out, most of us remember, and the beating of the Egyptian, a lot of us remember. But when was he rebuking the evil Hebrew? Well, right after he beat up the Egyptian, he thought that was a secret. And the next day he saw 2 Hebrew people fighting, right? 2 Israelites fighting. And he went up to one of them and said, hey, stop it, right? Stop beating up the other guy. To which the Hebrew guy said, are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian? Right. So notice, Moses saved an Israelite, and the very next day, he's trying to help another Israelite, and the Jewish guy is getting angry at him for it. Why? Because the two Jewish people were fighting, right? Because they had anger between themselves and they didn't want someone else to stop it. But Moses saw one person being hurt by another, and so he wanted to try and help. And then, of course, when he left, what is the first thing that happens after he leaves Egypt? He arrives and he finds Zipporah being harassed, being attacked by the Midianite other robbers, the other bandits, and he scares them off. Again, he's not trying to save himself. He's not trying to just stop something. He's trying to stop something that is wrong, that is happening to another person. Right? That's who Moses was. And from this, right, from this must every person of wide heart and Holy Spirit learn to take a stand and save their brothers and sisters from the hand of those who exploit them, who hurt them, who take advantage of them, especially in those places where our brothers and sisters are oppressed and tormented by those of no covenant. So if you see somebody being hurt, if you see somebody in need, if you see somebody who is being exploited, stopping the bad person is when we have to do step up, when we have to do tochacha, we have to do rebuke. When there's a victim, then rebuke is necessary. Make sense? All right, so that's the clearest thing, right? You see somebody beating up a child, you don't walk away, right? Maybe if you think it's dangerous, you have to call the police rather than stopping it yourself, but you have to do something, right? That's the clearest example. Good? Okay. Sometimes we have to speak up, however, even if there isn't a victim that's happened, that's of the problem. So this is from Rambam, from Mishnah Torah. If one sees that someone sinned or walked in a way that is not good, it is their duty to bring them back to the right path and point out that he or she is wronging him or herself by this evil course. As it is said, you shall surely rebuke your neighbor. Remember what we said from Leviticus 19. So you see somebody and they are doing drugs, right? Now, there's not a victim except the person themselves, right? They're not putting the drugs into another person. They're putting it into themselves. We have an obligation, which we're going to have to work with, but at the start, we have an obligation, if we see this problem, to try and tell them, hey man, drugs are bad, right? That's going to be harmful to yourself. However, one who rebukes another, whether for offenses against the one who rebukes him or herself, meaning if you did something bad to me and I need to tell you that was bad, or for sins against God, like they're doing something else that's breaking a commandment, but it isn't against me, they should administer the rebuke in private and speak to the offender gently and tenderly and point out that the rebuke is offered for the wrongdoer's own good, right? To secure for the other life in the world to come. So that means if, Mr. Smith is doing drugs, I don't go up in front of everybody and say, all right, do you know Mr. Smith does drugs, right? This guy, I saw him taking heroin the other day. Mr. Smith, you have to stop. Right? That is not rebuke. That is bringing guilt because of the situation, right? You are adding a new sin for yourself because of how you're treating Mr. Smith. Right? So you have to do rebuke, but you have to make sure you don't cause a new sin while you're doing it. So you have to, if you're doing it, do it in private, and you have to do it gently and tenderly. It has to be with love. Is there someone at the door? What's that? Kathy? She probably has a key. There's another committee meeting. She was looking around? Oh, okay. Well, then, yeah, go ahead. Did you say Kathy or Katie? Okay, it's someone else. Okay. It's someone who usually comes to this class. No? Okay, well, we'll let them in. If we know them, if we see them from the shul, they're not a complete stranger to us. We let them in. All good? Okay. So, and we're going to come back to this but if you're giving, I think you might be in a different meeting. Hi, Nikki. Yeah, safety and security is probably going to be meeting in the conference room. Yeah, the office. Too many meetings. You know, a synagogue should be busy. So if, and we're going to come back to that if you're giving rebuke, if you're pointing out someone's mistake, it has to be done privately, and it has to be done for that person's benefit. Right? You don't point out someone's mistake because it makes you feel good. You can only point out someone's mistake if it's for their good. And in fact, if you know that I'm really going to enjoy this, got it. I finally got it, right? I get to tell him what his mistake was. Then you shouldn't, right? Keep your mouth shut because you're giving it in the wrong spirit. It has to be done with the right spirit. Why? If the person accepts the rebuke, let's go back to the best case. You take the person privately, you do it to them nicely, and they say, you know what, you're right, I shouldn't have done that. Good, everything's good. If not, then the person should be rebuked a second and a third time. And one is bound to continue the admonitions, that's the criticism, until the sinner assaults the admonisher and says, I refuse to listen. But notice there is a limit. If I'm telling Mr. Smith, you shouldn't do drugs. It's like, Mr. Smith, you shouldn't do drugs. Mr. Smith, you shouldn't do. Shut up, right? Stop telling me that. Then I can step back. Right? If the person tells me to stop trying to fix them, to stop trying to correct them, once they tell me that, I have to stop. Why? We're going to get to, because that's not in this quote, we're coming up to that. Why do I have to help if the person is willing to listen? If they're willing to listen, why do I have to help? Because whoever is in a position to prevent wrongdoing and does not is responsible for the iniquity, for the sins of the wrongdoer whom that person might have restrained. I think of this like as a good friend. Your good friend comes to you and he's like totally drunk. And he's like, man, I need to borrow your car. You going to give him the keys? Right? If you give him the keys and he goes out and he kills someone, you're responsible because you had the power to stop him from doing what he was about to do. And if you didn't have the power to stop him, then it's not your fault. If you tried what you did and the guy said, pushed you down, took the keys and ran out the door, then you're not responsible anymore. But if you had the ability to stop someone and you didn't, and you didn't even try, then you're as guilty as that person. Okay, so this is the best case scenario, right? Where there's somebody that's doing something that's wrong and you try to help them in private, lovingly, tenderly, and they listen to you and everything gets fixed. But it's never that easy, right? It's never that easy. So we're going to do a story, the story that the rabbis tell when they want to know what actually triggered the destruction of the temple. Because sinat chinam, this hatred, that was around for a long time, right? The arguments and the fights, those were going for decades. What was the trigger event? And they tell the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, right? So those are two different people, but one person has the name Kamsa and the other one has the name Bar Kamsa. So I have the shorthand of the story up here, but I want to tell you slightly the longer version, right? So the longer version is a guy decided to have a party because, people used to have parties 2,000 years ago. And so he tells his servant to go and invite Kamsa to come to his party. But the servant takes the invitation to a guy called Bar Kamsa. The problem is Bar Kamsa and the host of the party are enemies. So all of a sudden, Bar Kamsa gets an invitation to come to this guy's party who's his enemy. And he's like, oh, okay, I guess maybe, things are going to be cool with us now. So Bar Kamsa comes to the party. And the host sees the guy walk in. It's like, what are you doing here? Right? He's like, I was invited. And the host says, get out. And Bar Kamsa says, look, don't humiliate me. I just let me stay and it'll be fine. Right? We don't need to do this. And the guy says, get out. And Bar Kamsa says, look, let me just pay for whatever I eat, like a restaurant. And then, I'll leave. Get out. And he says, let me pay for half the party. And just don't embarrass me in front of this crowd of all these people. And the guy throws him out of the party completely. Doesn't listen to any reason. Bar Kamsa then thinks to himself, the sages right? The rabbis, they were sitting there, meaning there were rabbis at the party, and they saw all of this happen, and they did not stop it. So I will go and inform against them to Rome, meaning he's going to go and spread lies to the Romans about the Jews in order to punish them because they didn't stop the host from embarrassing him. Right? You see the way one opportunity to stop something that was wrong, right? The rabbi should have stood up to defend Bar Kamsa and tried to make peace and tried to prevent the humiliation. Because they missed that, this guy now wants his revenge. Right? This is one of the old versions of fake news, because he's going to go give a rumor to the Romans. So he told the Romans that the people were rebelling against the empire. They asked for proof. They said, prove to us that the Jews are causing another revolution. We'd already had a few, but prove that you're having a revolution. Well, since he claimed that they didn't offer up the sacrifices sent on behalf of the Romans, meaning the Romans used to send cows to the temple, and the Kohanim, the priests, would offer up the sacrifices on behalf of Rome. That was perfectly fine. Right? The Roman priests couldn't do it, but our priests could do that. And he was telling the Romans, you know those cows you send? They don't actually make the sacrifices. Right? They just throw them away. And so the Romans are very upset about this, and they want to check it. And so he told them to put this to the test. So they sent with him a fine calf, a nice, perfect cow. And on the way between the Romans and the temple, he made a blemish on its upper lip, which means like inside its mouth. Right? He made a wound, a problem for the cow, in a place where we, that is to say Jewish law, think that's a problem, that we can't use that as a sacrifice. But Roman sacrificial law says it's okay. No problem. Right? So now we've got this loaded cow. Right? It's like a ticking bomb. This cow that's coming to the altar. And if we sacrifice it, we're breaking Jewish law. And if we don't sacrifice it, the Romans are going to murder us. Tick, 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 tick. All because the rabbis wouldn't stand up when there was this problem at the party. I noticed how just two guys who were having a fight, this has now destroyed the entire nation of Israel. Because what happens? When it reaches the temple, the sages were inclined to offer it in order not to offend the Romans. Right? So the sages said, all right, it's against halakha to offer this on the altar, but if we don't, there will be war, and there will be tens of thousands or more dead. So we have to go ahead and offer it. Right? But Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus said, people will say that blemished animals are offered on the altar. He said, you can't do that. If you do that, people are going to think that it's okay to bring these kind of animals just regularly. So the rabbis then proposed to kill Bar Kamsa so that he should not go and inform against them. Right? It's like, well, this guy's the problem, Bar Kamsa over here. So if we kill him, he can't tell the Romans anything. And the same rabbi, Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus, said, is one who makes a blemish on consecrated animals to be put to death? Right? Is this really the death penalty? Which the answer is no. And Rabbi Yochanan thereupon, so I should point out that in between this and this, the rabbis can do nothing. They can't offer the animal. They can't stop Bar Kamsa. And so they don't sacrifice. The Romans get mad. They attack. We have the war, and the second temple is destroyed. And so Rabbi Yochanan remarked, he said, because of the scrupulousness, because of the over-carefulness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus, our house has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we ourselves exiled from our land. So this one guy, right, Rabbi Zechariah, because of him, we got kicked out. Now, was it only him? Of course not. Obviously, the Romans were the people who actually had the weapons. But what is he trying to teach us here? So he's trying to teach us that Rabbi Zechariah stopped because he criticized their plan when he should have kept his mouth shut, because he didn't see that in this situation there was a special circumstance. He pushed everyone else towards this extreme position that led to the destruction. Right? So this is an example of when you should speak up, people were silent, right? At the party, they should have spoken up and said, you know, this is not cool. You're embarrassing this guy. Let's find some peace. Let's take it in the other room. Let's have a private, you know, conversation. We'll come. And they didn't. And here, where somebody should have kept his mouth shut, instead he's talking. So because he got it backwards, everything was destroyed, which is what we commemorate on Saturday night and Sunday. Questions about the story? It's one of the most depressing stories we've got.
What's his nationality?
He was Jewish.
Oh, he's Jewish?
Yeah, he was the regular Jewish guy, but he was so angry that the rabbis, who were the people who were supposed to be the leaders and the teachers, didn't act appropriately, that he wanted to take revenge. Now, did he know it would be this bad? I don't know. But that's what...
That's what it is. Gittin 5.
In the Talmud, yeah, Gittin 55b is where the full story is, right? This is the condensed version.
So what we have is Rabbi Zachariah.
Mm-hmm.
He's so sweet because we're not allowed to offer blemish.
Of course not.
On the altar. We're talking to Hashem.
Exactly.
We're supposed to be perfect.
Of course.
But this one wasn't perfect.
Nope.
But there was a time to be a little bit.
There was a time when you needed to be flexible.
More flexible
to avoid war.
To avoid war.
Exactly.
So if a situation like this happens and we are there, somebody has to step up and say something.
Exactly right. And someone should have said to Rabbi Zachariah, shut up. You know,
what's our good rabbis there?
Well, there were lots of good rabbis, yeah. But, you know, sometimes it's hard to speak up, right? Sometimes it's hard to say, like, I'm sure the rabbis at the party were just going, oh, man. Do you see what they're doing?
But I don't most people do.
I just came for the party. I didn't.
Exactly.
I don't want to get involved. And that was the problem. And here, you know, Rabbi Zachariah, he makes good points. I mean, he's saying if you offer a blemished animal, the people are going to think it's okay. And we don't want them to think that that's okay. And then he says, and if you kill the guy, people are going to think that if you bring a blemished animal, it's murder. I mean, we have to kill you. And then people aren't going to want to bring animals because, you know, what if they bring one by mistake? So he's making good points, but someone had to explain to him, look, those are good points. And if this was a regular Tuesday, I'd agree with you. But we've got the Roman army out there. And if we don't do this, because they knew the guy's plan, this is going to be war. And unfortunately, again, the rabbis lacked the courage to stop his excesses. And that was really a symptom all of this whole time, right? The time that the Second Temple was destroyed, there were many zealots. There were many people who were super passionate and super convinced they were right and only they were right. You had the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scroll group that lived out in the area we call Qumran near the Dead Sea. If you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the special documents that were discovered that are 2,000 years old, those people, they thought they had the truth of Judaism. Right? They moved out there because they thought that Jerusalem was now impure, was corrupt. And they were going to be out there and there was going to be a destruction. And then they would come back and they would be able to run the temple properly and all of that. They died out. But they used to go to the mikveh like 5 times a day, and they, you know, all wore the same color clothes and all sorts of other things. They were extremists. And then you had the zealots. And the zealots were not exactly religious extremists. They were national extremists. They said, you know, Israel should be free of the Romans no matter what. And if a Jewish person said no, they killed the Jewish person. Right? So they killed the Jewish person in order to free the Jewish people, which is, but that's what happens with fanatics, right? When you allow your passion, your extremism to become something that you are pushing onto others, chances are they don't want it, right? Doesn't mean you can't share your passion, right? Sing a song, be happy, tell a good story, fine. But as soon as you push someone up against a wall and say, you have to agree with me, then we have gone the wrong direction, right? That is not the way to go. Okay, onward. Proverbs, right? The book of Mishlei. To correct a scoffer or rebuke a wicked person for their blemish is to call down abuse on oneself. But remember, we said at the beginning, if you see someone doing something wrong, you have to say something. But now we see in the book of Proverbs that for some people, if you try to point out their mistake, all you're going to get is a fist to the face, right? Or their anger, which is a bigger problem than just whether or not you're going to, have a punch. We'll come back to that in a minute. But basically what Mishlei is saying is, yes, you have to rebuke, but only under certain circumstances, right? Do not rebuke a scoffer. This is somebody who God, Judaism, whatever. Don't rebuke them because they'll hate you. And that matters, right? You might think, I don't care if people like me. I'm going to tell it like it is, right? I'm a straight talking, right? I may be blunt, but I always speak honestly, right? I always tell the truth. Yeah, but if you tell the truth and someone hates you for it, what good did you do? Right? Did you help them? No. Did you help yourself? Not really. Did you help the world? Did you help the community? No. So keep your mouth shut. If you know your words are going to make the other person angry, keep your mouth shut. Reprove a wise person, right? Somebody who is willing to listen, who is eager to listen, who wants to learn from you, they will love you, right? So knowing who the person you're talking to, and sometimes it also depends on what topic. Right? I can give somebody advice about Judaism, but if I try to give somebody advice about playing baseball, they're probably not going to welcome my advice. They're going to say, "Gee, Rabbi, thanks very much, but you're not exactly like a baseball genius." So you have to be able to understand before you open your mouth. Instruct a wise person, and they will grow wiser. Teach a righteous person, and they will gain in learning. Make sense?
So the rebuke applies more for your fellow Jew and your family, and people outside better.
No, the rebuke applies for people that are being victimized, right? So remember, we go back to our first case with Moses. If you see somebody who is being victimized, if someone being hurt by another person, then it doesn't matter whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish. We have to speak up. Right? If there's somebody out on the street and they're being beat up, I don't ask if they're Jewish or not. I'm calling the cops because no one should get beaten up. Right? And I have to do something to try and stop it. If there's somebody that I think would listen and they want to, and I think, I see this person and he's a nice guy. Maybe he's like my neighbor. He's not Jewish, but he's a nice guy. And I know he wants to learn. And he doesn't know that the way he's trimming that tree is going to kill the tree. Right? Maybe he doesn't know. But I know that he's a nice guy, he's a reasonable guy, that I can go say, my grandfather, he used to teach me about trees. And I think he said, notice the way I'm being gentle and think and maybe and sort of, not, you're going to kill that tree, man. But just, I think I remember him saying something like, you only trim a tree like this or above the branch or below. By doing that, if the person's reasonable, and I know he's reasonable, it's good. But if I know my neighbor is this crazy guy, and every time we talk, it's an argument, then I just have to sit back and watch the tree die because there's nothing I can do, right? Because if I go over and try and say, I think maybe sort of, it's going to be boom, and now there's more anger between him and me. And that's not worth it for a tree, right? It's worth it to save a person, but it's not worth it to save a tree. It's difficult, right? To find that balance and to know who you should be talking to. All right. How do we know that if a person has rebuked a neighbor 4 or 5 times without success, the person should continue to rebuke? Remember, this is only if the person is listening and hasn't pushed you away and is willing to at least listen. And you've said it 4 times, like, every time the guy comes out and he's walking the dog and he keeps leaving, the dog on your lawn, you say, man, you left it on my lawn again. And tomorrow he does it again. And again, I can keep talking to him as long as he's reasonable, as long as there's no new anger, no hate, but just I remind him. I get to do that forever, right? Because it says you shall surely rebuke the other. One might infer, you might think that rebuke should be carried so far as to change a person's face with shame. So what this phrase means is you might think that telling somebody that they're making a mistake is so important that you should do it even if it makes their face go red or white. right? That they get embarrassed or they get angry. You know, that I can rah, 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 and so much that their face changes, but hey, it's more important that I tell them what's right. You shall not bring guilt upon the other, right? The second half of that verse. Rabbi Tarfon said, in this generation, there is no one capable of rebuking. And basically, he means nowadays, nobody knows how to do this right. Nobody is able to give good criticism in a way that people will hear and listen. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, in this generation, there is no one capable of receiving a rebuke, which is why you can't give it, right? If everybody is so sensitive and so defensive and so quick to get angry, then you just have to keep your mouth closed. But notice, everybody, even the rabbis, were saying about each other that they can't have that kind of conversation because everybody is too quick to explode. And Rabbi Akiva said, in this generation, there was no one how rebuke ought to be worded. So his argument is, it's true that no one takes it well, but that's because we all keep getting it wrong when we try to share. Right? So people could listen to rebuke if we knew the magic words, right? If we did it in exactly the right way, privately, tenderly, with love, and only if we know it is welcome. If we know the person doesn't want it, even if I'm doing it with a smile on my face and a love in my heart, don't do it. Right? If the person doesn't want it, then you can't. But if you think the person might, if I can do it right, well, maybe. But as soon as the person says, then we're done. As again, rebuking should never bring a new sin, because that's what leads to the temple collapsing. Okay. But we should try to be open, as Rabbi Akiva says, right? Ben Zoma said, who is one that is wise? One who learns from every person. For it is said in Psalms, for all my teachers have I gained understanding. So we should try to be able to learn from other people. But sometimes that's hard, right? Sometimes there's just some friction that doesn't work well. What we really should do is try to make ourselves open to criticism, right? Most of the time we spend our life trying to make the other people listen to us, right? Let me tell you what you did wrong, right? We love that sentence. But you know what your mistake was? You know what I would have done if I'd been you, right? That's our favorite sentence. But what we should be saying is, what do you think I did wrong? Tell me what you think I could have improved. And I don't mean that like as a joke, but I mean as a real sentence, right? What would you have done in that situation, right? Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said a person should love rebuke, since as long as there is rebuke in the world, ease of mind comes to the world. Good and blessing come to the world, and evil departs from it. As it says, again from Proverbs, those who rebuke find favor, and a good blessing falls upon them. So if you make yourself open to criticism from good people who are willing to actually do it the proper way, you can find good blessings from that. But that's really, really hard. It's much easier to tell other people what's wrong than ask other people what's better, right? It's just the way we are. Okay, as I mentioned at the very beginning, Bereshit Rabbah repeats that the rebuke only comes with love, right? It has to come from love. Rabbi Yossi ben Hanina said, a love without reproof is no love. I think about that for a second. It means that if you love somebody, then you have to be able to tell them when they make a mistake. Right? My wife loves me so much that she knows that I want her to tell me when I did something wrong. That's what love means. Love doesn't mean never criticizing. Love means that you have a relationship where you can point out the mistakes and that everybody understands, giver and receiver of the criticism, that everything is being done with love. That's how it should be done. And if you are at all unsure, then you don't. Right? Reish Lakish, who we're going to talk about again in a few minutes, Reish Lakish said, reproof leads to peace. A peace where there has been no reproof is no peace. Right? So ultimately, and we see this all over the world, just because you aren't arguing doesn't mean you have peace, right? If your neighbor is driving you crazy with dropping his dog stuff on your lawn and you keep your mouth shut, that doesn't mean you have peace with your neighbor. That just means inside of you, you are hating him more and more and more because you haven't told him that there's something that's a mistake going on. And it could be he doesn't even really think about what's happening. Maybe for him, it's no big deal on his lawn when other people do it. And so he doesn't think it's a big deal for you. If you really want to have peace, you have to talk if there's a problem between you, right? Again, this is not talking about see somebody else doing something that doesn't affect you and doesn't affect another person. This is talking about if someone's doing something that affects you. You do have to share, you know, the way you talked to me during the meeting, that really made me unhappy. If you don't at least share it, again, if you assume that the person could hear it, they're not, you know, totally angry with you, then you're never going to have true peace. Clear? That's not 100% clear because this is hard. This is hard stuff. I always tell people, you know what? Keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat, praying, doing, you know, all of the commandments like that, those are easy. Not gossiping, knowing how to criticize, when not to criticize, letting go of anger, that's the hard stuff. That is the hard stuff. So who may rebuke? This is from Likutei Moharan. This is from Nachman of Bratslav, a Hasidic rabbi of the 1800s. And even though rebuke is a great thing, and it is incumbent, it's our responsibility upon each Jew to rebuke his friend when he sees him acting in a way that is not allowed. As it says back in Leviticus, you will rebuke your neighbor. Even so, not everyone is able to do it. As Rabbi Akiva said, we saw, I would be surprised if there is a person in our generation who is able to rebuke, who knows how to rebuke. And if Rabbi Akiva said that about his generation, all the more so today, right? In his generation, you had some of the greatest people who ever lived. And nowadays, not so much, right? We have had a little bit of a deterioration since that day. Because when one rebukes who is not able to rebuke, then one will not be able to receive his rebuke, and he causes a putrid soul smell in the souls that hear his rebuke, right? If I use the wrong words, the other person won't hear it as loving and helpful. It will instead become like a seed in them that will become rotten and make them full of anger and hate. Right? So rather than helping them, I am pushing something bad into them. And that's just not allowed. Because by means of his rebuke, he actually arouses the nasty scent of the bad actions and bad qualities in those he rebukes. So this is a very interesting insight. Like I said, Rabbi Nachman lived in the 1800s, but in the 1900s and 2000s, we've actually discovered that he is right. There's a psychological effect. It's called the backfire effect. So imagine you take somebody who is on one side of a political topic. For example, right? So maybe they think that taxes should be lowered, and they think taxes should be lowered because it will help the economy. Right? So imagine that's their position, or you can imagine the opposite, and then you give them evidence that their position is wrong. Right? So you show this person actually lower taxes do help. You show that person actually lower taxes don't help. A reasonable idea would be that if you give me evidence, I'll change my opinion. That's not what we find in psychology, right? When they do studies and they do research and they have people that come in, volunteers, they find that if you show somebody that what they believe is wrong, they believe it stronger. If it's like a major thing, right? If it's like, when was, the Alaska added to America and they got the wrong date, that they can fix. But if it's something that's important to them, and you tell them something that they believe is wrong, even if you have all the facts, they will refuse to admit what you said, and they will instead believe harder that they are right. They may have to invent new facts. They may have to change their explanation of why they believe it, but they double down on that idea. because they feel attacked. And when people feel attacked, they don't say, thank you for attacking me, right? They throw up their guard, their defense, and that makes them stronger against the attack. And so if you really want to change most people's minds, rebuke nowadays is never the way to do it. Right? Nowadays, taking someone, aside in private and say, your dog keeps leaving, da 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 da. Nowadays, that's not ever going to work. Almost never. Right? If the person's already doing it, you're probably not going to find the right words. And in fact, if you do say it, they're probably going to bring their dog to your lawn every day, not just once a week, in order to prove that they don't care what you. So instead, what do you have to do? You have to find other ways. You can example with your own dog, right? Have your dog on their lawn, your dog drops, and then you pick it up, right? And say, oh, I don't want to leave that there. That wouldn't be right. And make sure your neighbor can hear you. You give an example of what you're doing. You don't try to go and confront the person, right? You don't try and attack it head on. You try and go from the side. Or you also sometimes have to decide, is it really a problem? Maybe what's happening is my problem, which we will again come back to. Okay, remember I mentioned Reish Lakish before. Well, Reish Lakish has an example of what can happen when all of this goes wrong. I mean, as all of you know, because I keep saying it, in Judaism we love debate, right? We love to argue about things. We think that if I give my opinion and you give your opinion about Torah, that together we can create a better understanding. But it's a very delicate process. Right? We don't just argue like kids wrestling in the playground. You have to have the right partner and you have to have the right idea. So, the story of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Again, one of my favorite stories. And if you need tissues when we're done, this is a sad story. One day, Rabbi Yochanan was bathing in the Jordan. He was down in the river. And you have to understand, Rabbi Yochanan was considered to be the most beautiful person in the world at that time. And I mean beautiful, not handsome. And Reish Lakish saw him and leapt into the Jordan after him. Now, who was Reish Lakish at this time? At this time, Reish Lakish wasn't a rabbi. At this time, Reish Lakish was a bandit. He was a robber. Right? He was a criminal. He was somebody who, when he saw this beautiful person down in the river, he was jumping in to rape what he thought was a woman. Right? He saw a beautiful person in the river, and Reish Lakish is like, I'm just going to go rape her. That's what kind of person he was. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, your strength should be for Torah. Right? He sees this guy, this beautiful man, macho, bandit, criminal, buff, jumping in naked to rape this woman himself. And he's like, why do you waste your strength on this? Right? You have so much strength, so much power, Mr. Lakish. You should use it for Torah. And Reish Lakish responds, your beauty should be for women. Right? It's like, you think my strength is wasted? Your beauty's wasted. You're a guy. Right? So what did Rabbi Yochanan say back? He says, if you repent, if you change, I will let you marry my sister, who is more beautiful than I am. How's that for a deal? And Reish Lakish accepts. Right? This guy who is this criminal, mastermind, evil, rapist, murdering, terrible, terrible man. He's convinced. Right? He's convinced by beauty, but he becomes a great rabbi. He repents, and then when he wished to return and collect his weapons that he had left at the side of the river, he couldn't. Right? He went to pick them up, and he just couldn't touch them anymore. Right? So it was a sincere change. Right? He really had pushed aside his past life. And Rabbi Yochanan taught him the Bible, he taught him Mishnah, and he made him into a great man. So Reish Lakish becomes a great rabbi alongside Rabbi Yochanan. And in fact, they become partners, what we call a chavruta. Right? They study together. So one day, this is like many, many years later, one day there was a dispute in the Beit Midrash. A sword, a knife, a dagger, a spear, a handsaw, a scythe. Right? These are all sharp items. At what stage can they become unclean? This is a very, very small point in Jewish law. We talked about this a little bit when talking about Sukkot, but an item in Judaism that is a natural product cannot become ritually unclean, right? If you have a dead body in a tree, the tree is still ritually pure. But if you have an item that is man-made, then it can become ritually impure. If you have a dead body on a bed, the bed becomes ritually impure. The bed's made out of wood. And the question that we always have to ask is, between tree and bed, when is it man-made? Right? When I cut off the limb? No, still natural. When I shave the bark? Still not. At what point does it become man-made? And here they're talking about metal. If I have a piece of metal, that comes from the dirt, and I turn it into a knife, a spear, a weapon, at what point does it become an actual item, not just fancy dirt, right? So they want to know where's that moment that it happens. When their crafting is finished, of course. And when is their crafting finished? Rabbi Yochanan ruled when they are tempered in a furnace, right? If you've ever seen how someone makes a knife, a real knife, not just, stamped out of metal, but one that they hammer and everything. After they have hammered it and gotten the shape, they put it back in the heat to make it strong. Reish Lakish said, when it's been quenched in the water, which is only like 30 seconds later. You put it back in the furnace, it gets hard, and then you bring it out and you go, psh. So Rabbi Yochanan says this, Reish Lakish says that. Psh. We got the argument? Okay, so far, so good. This is normal, right? This kind of argument is the standard argument you see in the Talmud. And then it goes bad. And Rabbi Yochanan says, a bandit understands his trade, which is basically like saying, well, I guess you understand weapons because you're a bandit. This is years later. Reish Lakish couldn't even pick up his weapons years ago. And now in the middle of the argument, which was so good, so normal, Rabbi Yochanan is reminding him of being a thief before. Right? It's what we call a low blow. Right? That is not cool. And he said to him, Reish Lakish responds, how have you helped me? Before I was called master, a master thief, and now I'm called master. I'm a master of Judaism. To which Rabbi Yochanan gets angry and responds, by bringing you under the wings of the Shekhinah. What do you mean, how have I helped you? You were a bandit before, now you're saved, right? You know Torah, you're not sinning anymore. Of course I've helped you. I can't read lips. The security meeting's down there. We're finishing up this is pathway class. Yeah. I need to hang a sign on the door. I can't read lips. I know, it's like I feel like I'm doing baseball songs. Well, a little bit of laughter in the middle of the story. So Rabbi Yochanan gives a low blow. Reish Lakish responds angrily and says something that's mean, which is basically like, so what? You can't even see that I'm any different than I was, when I jumped in that river? He gets mad and says, you're worthless. You've done nothing for me, which isn't true. Of course he's done something, but he's angry. And so he says something stupid in order to try and get back at Rabbi Yochanan, who said something stupid. Right? You see how this is building? And then Rabbi Yochanan felt hurt. Right? How could you tell me I did nothing? And Reish Lakish, he gets sick. Right? These two friends, they're brothers-in-law. They are now fighting and hurt so much that they can't even be happy, right? They're broken inside. So his sister, Rabbi Yochanan's sister, which remembers, Reish Lakish's wife now, she came and wept before Rabbi Yochanan and said, forgive him for the sake of my son. Right? Look, my husband is dying of sadness. Go and make up, right? Be friends again. And he replied, leave your fatherless children, I will preserve them alive, which is a quote from Tanakh, which is basically, let him die, God will take care of your orphans. She says, for the sake of my widowhood then, and let your widows trust in me. Right? God will take care of you. Let him die. That's how angry he is. And Reish Lakish dies. And Rabbi Yochanan was plunged into deep grief. Right? He's devastated. Now when his friend is dead, now he feels sorry.
Too late.
It's worse. Said the rabbis, who will go and ease his mind? Who's going to go help Rabbi Yochanan? Who can go and help make him, recover? let Rabbi Elazar ben Padat go, whose disquisitions are very subtle. He's a brilliant mind, right? He asks all the right questions. He's a very, very clever man. So this poor guy, Rabbi Elazar, goes, and he sits before him. And for every law that Rabbi Yochanan says, he would say, there's a Braita which supports you. Right? So Rabbi Yochanan would say, I think the answer is A. And Rabbi Elazar ben Padat would say, you're right. And I have more proof to help you. And Rabbi Yochanan said, are you then the son of Lachish? Right? Do you think you can take Reish Lakish's place with that kind of behavior? He's angry because the guy agrees with him. Remember, Reish Lakish was arguing with him. This guy's agreeing. But he's angry that the guy is agreeing. When I stated a law, right, before, when Reish Lakish was alive, when I stated a law, the son of Lakish would raise 24 objections, to which I gave 24 answers, which led to a fuller understanding of the law. While you say a Braita has been taught that supports you, do I not know that I'm right? Like, why are you trying to help me? I don't need you to help me. I need you to challenge me. And thus he went on, rending his garments and weeping, where are you, son of Lachish? Where are you, son of Lachish? And he cried thus until his mind was turned, and the rabbis prayed for him, and he died. So both of them end up dead because of their fight. I told you it was a sad story. It's appropriate with Tisha B'Av coming up around the corner. Why? Because one person took a low blow during the argument, and the other person naturally responded with anger, and the first person responded with anger to that person's anger, and no one wanted to just say, look, I'm sorry, and I forgive you for what you said. And it tore them apart. Okay. Mesilat Yesharim, great book of the Musar movement. Very often a man will try to rebuke sinners in such a place or at such a time that he will cause them to go even further in their wickedness and to add to their sins by desecrating the name of God, right? So you try and correct somebody. You know, imagine if I walked up to every person who was Jewish and who I saw eating something that wasn't kosher and went, what are you doing here eating this, right? What is the response going to be? Oh, thank you, Rabbi, for pointing out in the middle of the restaurant that I'm eating something that isn't kosher. Are they going to thank me? They're going to make a donation to the shul? No, they're going to not only be angry at me, but they'll be angry at God. Because that's how people work. Right? Ah, you religious people, you're all the same. This is why I never go to synagogue, because, you know, Judaism is so messed. They will desecrate God's name because I was trying to help. In such cases, silence alone constitutes saintliness. As our sages of blessed memory said, just as it is a mitzvah to be listened to, so it is a mitzvah to say, just as it is a mitzvah to say what will be listened to, so is it a mitzvah not to say what will not be listened to. Right? We are commanded to speak and we are commanded to be silent. And the trick is to know when. But on average, silence is better than speaking. Right? Because often when we speak, we do more harm than good. Just to give an example of what can happen, because we need one more sad story. Shaul, this is King Saul, when Jonathan was challenging him about how he was trying to treat David, he flew into a rave and he said, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman. The Hebrew is actually a little bit worse than that. I know that you side with David to your own shame and the shame of your mother's nakedness. For as long as David lives, neither you nor your kingdom will be secure. Now then, have him brought to me because he is marked for death. Right? Saul was going to kill David. But Jonathan spoke up and said to his father, why should he be put to death? What has he done? Right? Which is a reasonable sentence. You notice he's not shouting. He's not calling his father stupid. Even though his father is humiliating him in public, he's not trying to fight back with humiliating words. He's not being super angry. And at that, Shaul threw a spear at Jonathan to strike him down. So he's trying to save the kingdom for his son, and now he's trying to kill the son that he's trying to save the kingdom for. That's what anger does to people. And Jonathan realized that his father was determined to kill David. So Jonathan rose from the table angry and did not eat any food that second day of the month because he was so sad about David, because his father had humiliated him. But he leaves. Right? Rather than saying anything else, he leaves. He goes off and he helps save David. So he does something very important. But at this point, he realizes he can't talk to his father. And if you can't talk to the person, then don't. Right? If he just stayed and fought, one of them would have ended up dead. That story we can skip because we're running out of time. So one important thing to keep in mind whenever you think about trying to judge another person is what we call bekaf zachut, that when you judge a person, you should always do so on the side of merit. And if you see somebody doing something, you should always think, is there a good explanation? Is there a reasonable explanation? Is there something maybe in their life that's going on that I don't know about that made them do what they're doing? Maybe I didn't understand what they did. Maybe I misheard what they said, right? Maybe not so sure about if I'm right and maybe they're right, or maybe there's two different opinions that are both right. You should always try to see if there's some possible positive explanation for whatever you see another person doing. And that means that you don't have to rebuke because what they did wasn't wrong. Right? You may have thought it was wrong, but if you think more carefully, maybe they're not wrong. Right? Maybe your understanding of the situation is what's wrong. And that's what we mean by kaf zachut, in the side of merit. And one last thing from the Baal Shem Tov is we should always see the world around us as being a mirror to ourselves as well. So the Baal Shem Tov planted for us this teaching. If you see another person doing something ugly, right? You see somebody doing something bad, meditate on the presence of that same ugliness in ourselves. Right? If you see someone doing something wrong, there is probably a little bit of that in you. Right? That it is one of God's mercies that God brought this sight before your eye, so as to bring you back to repentance. Right? God didn't arrange for you to see that person being, their behavior so that you could fix them. God arranged you to see that so you could fix you. Right? God is holding up a mirror in that person so you look at yourself more carefully. Right? If you saw someone desecrating Shabbat or desecrating God's name in some other way, you should examine your own deeds. And you will certainly find among them desecration of Shabbat and cursing God's name. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It doesn't have to be the same thing as the other person. But if you're noticing it in them, chances are it is something in you as well. Right? Or if you heard some profanity or obscene language, you should consider your own impotence, right? Your own, when you failed to conduct yourself modestly. Have you not ever said anything that was similar? Or when you do it, do you think, oh, that's justified, it's okay, it's just a little thing. I didn't say words as bad as that person. All the things we use to excuse ourselves, right? If you heard someone skeptical or some skeptical or atheistic talk from someone, then you should work to strengthen your faith and your trust in God. So if you hear somebody say something that you think, oh, they're rejecting Torah, don't go all angry on them. Think to yourself, am I really strong enough in my faith of God? And should I work on that for myself rather than working on that person? Right? Turn your direction inward. Chances are you will have the wrong words and the person won't want to hear them in the first place. The one thing you can do is fix yourself. And if we had done that, the temple would still be standing. Take care, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.